Players are rather hyped about the jungle changes that are coming, which Riot hopes will bring up the effectiveness of jungle tanks. The first changes added were Grom's passive being increased with bonus health, Bammy's Cinder and the Cinder Hook items being added, and a few champions receiving some jungle friendly buffs. These changes felt rather misguided as they do not seem to tackle the early game problems junglers would have with their first and or second clears, especially concerning safety and sustain. I felt that Bammy's Cinder would be Quill Code 2.0 in that it may be a useful item, but it comes too late for it to make a difference for the tank jungler. By the time you get Bammy's Cinder, most tank junglers will not have an issue clearing anyways and have little to no sustain problems. Also, needing to invest a lot to even obtain the item in the first place is quite a detriment and hurts your build versatility. To its credit though, it is a powerful item once you do get it, and will help any tank jungler that gets behind on farm, and definitely will have an impact in team fights. In a sense, Riot has buffed the mid game and late game of plenty of junglers by giving them the damage and presence. The second slew of changes comes in the form of just flat out nerfing the damage of the most dangerous jungle monsters. This is a flat out universal buff for all junglers, and while bruisers will also be strengthened from it, tank junglers, especially the slow ones, will gain the most benefit from it. I welcome these changes wholeheartedly because it does seem they aren't just going to demolish bruiser champions, but instead boost tanks a bit. I mean, the early game is still a pain, but leeches should help most junglers, and the better tank junglers do not exactly have a problem with it. This is a very important thing to note, and why it is smart for Riot not to just make a flood of changes all at once. There are some tank junglers that are already good and very powerful, but are simply not meta, or they're not popular at all. I have a feeling that these changes can run the potential risk of making some of these champions very powerful and potentially even overpowered, but sadly not be able to save the weaker champions. To reiterate, the already strong tanks will become better, while the weak ones will likely continue to be weak. I also hope that the people understand that tanks are trading efficiency for power. They are losing cooldown reduction and tenacity in exchange for the Sunfire effect. Thankfully, there are more strong jungle tanks than there are weak ones, so the potential to see a resurgence of at least some of them is rather high. With that in mind, I do think there is a few junglers who could potentially become a menace with these jungle changes. The funny thing about this is that a few of them are not necessarily the most purest of tanks, but they will definitely see a power shift in the days to come. First off, Amumu is a jungler that is already very potent and is simply kept at bay because he's prone to being shut down or countered by certain picks such as Janna, Nami, and Lee Sin. He's fast and can be built AP to become a holy hand grenade, and also has the potential to initiate strong fights. For a tank, his damage is already on the upper end of the spectrum, and having a Sunfire cape that he can obtain early will bless him with even more power. Bammy's Cinder will also add much more power to his AoE clearing, to the point where he could probably power farm at speeds not even many bruisers could hope to match. Of course, as already mentioned, he has plenty of weaknesses, so he can be controlled, so I'm not too worried about him becoming insanely overpowered. The next champion is one I already clamored as being very powerful in this jungle, but simply unpopular and lacking in itemization. Volibear is more of a bruiser than a straight out tank, but the Cinder line is just so awesome on him. He did receive a buff to his W, but after testing it, it doesn't really help out his early game clearing until he gets a few ranks at least. His biggest weaknesses is that he has slow clearing, and he is prone to being kited, and he lacks strong initiation. That said, he's incredibly dangerous in early fights and ganks, and has some of the best jungle matchups of any jungler. Even some of the jungle dueling gods like Udi and Skarner can find themselves torn to pieces by Volibear. He already has good matchups versus some of the popular junglers like Lee Sin and Jarvan, but the problem has always been that he tends to get ignored as the game goes on, as his damage tapers off and his utility is on the lower end for fatties like him. I figure the Cinder Hulk will give him much more needed damage to become a threat in fights later into the game. As I said though, he's not a weak jungler at the moment, but is simply rough around the edges in a few things. He can snowball really hard early game and become a menace during mid game, but if he's ever behind, or sometimes even if he's on par with everyone else, he tends to flounder and suck. The Cinder line will help him out during those times where he's just even, and I think that just fixing that whole problem will bring him to the forefront. The other champion is a strong maybe, because the champion has easily exposed weaknesses, but already has strong snowball potential and a lethal late game. Sejuani's early game is notoriously rough, even compared to other tanks. The changes haven't done much to help this, aside from having the chickens and Gromp nerfed. With that said, Sejuani's potential damage and late game is among among the strongest of all tanks, and, arguably, is the strongest. She can have a rough mid-game due to her weak early game, but can be stupidly strong if she gets any gold boost through murder money. The Cinder line adds more AoE to her already strong AoE, but it is amplified further thanks to the bonus health on the Cinderhulk. This, again, is a late game benefit that she can get, but it has the potential to be absolutely crazy. I'm just divided on her because I am not too certain yet whether the Cinder line will truly rectify a lot of problems some junglers have. To sum it up, Sejuani's potential boon is that she may be getting a crap ton of damage soon. I am also mixed about one of my favorite junglers making a return. Trundle excels in metas that are tank heavy and bruiser heavy, since he can just rob them of their stats and outmaneuver them with his wall. Trundle has always been a very strong champion in the jungle, but he's always also been very meta sensitive. He has good speed, super sustain, high damage, tons of free stats, and a very unique form of utility. Of course though, none of his abilities are of immediate impact, so he's dependent on factors such as the composition of both the enemy team and his own team. The thing that makes his potential rise funny is that, while the Cinder line is not necessarily weak on him, he could potentially see play in the jungle or in top lane simply because he counters tanks and bruisers who do use it. Again, this is highly dependent if tanks manage to become a thing, but Trundle does have a disgusting advantage over them. Trundle can rip the stats right off a tank and simultaneously make himself unkillable while making the victim easier to shut down. His counter ganking and evasions are insane already, and plenty of tanks are prone to counter ganks. Most tanks have maneuverability problems throughout the game, and Trundle's wall can potentially shut them down in fights if properly placed, and sometimes can even nullify initiations. Again, Trundle's potential rise is completely dependent on the rise of the tanks, so it is completely up in the air whether this one will work out or not. That said, I have no damn clue why Riot buffed Trundle. He already had no issue whatsoever in the new jungle, and they straight out mega buffed him. I hope that doesn't lead to some random nerfs down the line. There are a few other junglers that benefit from the changes greatly too, but many of them will see similar boosts in strength to the ones I already explained, while others probably will not see a massive power shift. For many, the Cinder line would just likely be an equal boost in power similar to the rest of the other junglers, and nothing more. On that note, I did not mention Nautilus because he's in the process of receiving some wild changes, so I do not know where he will stand. I also stress that people must understand that the Cinder line may or may not make champions immediately godlike. I have a strong feeling that there will be plenty of players who will finally try out tank champions and realize how powerful they are, and then falsely attribute the strength of the champion to the item. Players need to realize that many of these champions are strong within their own rights, but certain variables kept them from being used or viable in certain metas. These are the champions I think will see a huge boost to the jungle, but I do not claim to predict that any of these will become competitively viable. We will not know whether or not the item will bring tank junglers to the forefront until the changes are released and we have players excruciatingly testing them out. I could be very wrong, or I could be right, but either way, I'm excited at the potential and hoping that jungle versatility sees a revitalization.